Good morning to all of you. Thank you for coming. I'm Lee Hamilton. I'm the president of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and it is a distinct pleasure for me to welcome you to today's conference on the impact of U.S.-China relations in Asia. Today's program examines the U.S.-China relationship from the perspective of its general impact on Asia. The bilateral relationship between the United States and China is widely regarded to be one of the most important in the world and is sure to have major implications in Asia in particular. We're extraordinarily pleased to welcome to the Center today a really very distinguished group of scholars from around Asia, Russia, Japan, Singapore, India, and other places, each of whom are here to present their views on this important topic. We look forward, of course, to hearing from them. I have no doubt at all that you'll have a very productive and instructive day. First, we are deeply privileged to welcome back to the Wilson Center Deputy Secretary of State Jim Steinberg, who's agreed to give us the administration's perspective on this complex and important topic. No one is better qualified to do so. As many of you know, Jim has had a distinguished career in both government and academia, one which truly embodies the spirit of the Wilson Center. Prior to his appointment as Deputy Secretary of State, Jim served as Dean of the Lyndon Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, a position from which he is now on leave. Previously, he was Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. He's held positions at several other advanced research institutions, including RAND Corporation and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. His previous work in government includes service in several vital positions in President Clinton's administration, including Deputy National Security Advisor, Chief of Staff of the U.S. State Department, and Director of the State Department's Policy and Planning Staff. He now serves, of course, with great distinction in his present position as Deputy Secretary of State. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Secretary Jim Steinberg. Jim, we're delighted to have you.
Well, thanks, Lee. It's great to be here, and it's always a pleasure to be back. And one of the best things about coming back is it gives me yet another chance to pay tribute to Lee Hamilton, who is one of the towering figures of public service of our time. And I've had the privilege of working with Lee in a lot of capacities over the years. And when I was dean at the LBJ School, I held him up and had him there as the paragon of public service. And if we had more Lee Hamiltons in the world, we would be even a finer country than we are today. And his service here at the Wilson Center is just the latest chapter in a really remarkable career. And we know that it will continue in other capacities, and we're really grateful for that. And his service to the President, especially in many administrations, as well as his service in Congress, is really quite remarkable. So it's good to be here. Back to talk about Asia. One of these days, you'll all invite me back to talk about Latin America or Africa, which I would welcome the chance to do. But I'm always happy to talk about Asia because it is enormously important to our future and to the future of our partners, not only in Asia but around the world. And I applaud you for this discussion today because I think one of the things that's very clear is that it is important to understand our relationship with China in the context of developments in Asia as a whole. And the range of countries that you have represented here and the scope of the geography, I think, is particularly important because particularly as I'll touch on in a minute, with the impending expansion of the East Asia Summit, I think we're beginning to have a sense of the kind of the political geography of Asia, which is now nicely represented in among a number of the voices that you'll hear today. It's also important, I think, to have such a conference because it is, I think, impossible to understand the trajectory and the objectives of our bilateral relationship with China without understanding the regional context. Because, as we've made clear in a number of contexts, including most recently in Secretary Clinton's speech to the Council on Foreign Relations 2 weeks ago, and my own talk to the IISS 2 days after that. We see this as part of a broader strategy of engagement by the United States as we try to deal with what we see as the fundamental strategic challenge of our time, which is how to generate enhanced global cooperation to deal with the increasingly common sets of challenges that we face, where most of the countries of the world share common interests, but we still lack the capacity to generate the kind of common and collective action that we need to address these problems, whether it's the global economic crisis, whether it's terrorism, proliferation, pandemic disease, or climate change. And these are all issues where many of the interests are in common, but we need to find better ways to work together. And as Secretary Clinton laid out, we have a sort of a three-part strategy to build that strengthened international cooperation. The first part being to build on and strengthen and adapt our traditional alliances, which continue to remain central to our overall strategy and the starting point of our strategy. And nowhere is that clearer than in East Asia, where we have longstanding treaty partnerships with 5 countries in the region, and they continue to remain as important today as they did during the Cold War, even though they have a very different tenor and a very different set of objectives. And as the Secretary and I have both pointed out, we've been working very hard with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, Thailand, and the Philippines to sustain those relationships with our continued strong commitment to our alliance with Japan, and looking forward to working with Prime Minister Khan. The President will be meeting with him in New York. Our remarkable I think strengthening of our ties with South Korea under the extraordinary leadership of President Im Young-bak, and our continued good relations with our partners in Australia who are back to work with their new government, and we look forward to working with them as well as with the Philippines and Thailand, very critical ASEAN partners for us. At the same time, as the Secretary pointed out, although this is the starting point, we recognize that with the emergence of new powers in Asia and around the world, that we need to make sure that they are an important part of that. They represent a significant enhancement of the capacity of the international community to meet the kinds of challenges that we're talking about. We don't see their rise as a zero-sum game that necessarily diminishes U.S. interest or inevitably leads to a rivalry or competition, though we recognize that there are risks in that direction, and that's why we have to work very hard, not just with China and India and Russia, but also some of the other critical emerging powers like Indonesia, a critically important power and increasingly close friend of the United States in East Asia. And that's why we focused very much during this administration on strengthening dialogue between these partners, because we recognize that in order to get the positive sum benefits and enhance the prospect of a good result over time, we need to deepen dialogue. And you all know here about the strategic and economic dialogue that was launched last year, chaired by Secretaries Clinton and Geithner on our side, and Daibing Guo and Wang Qishan on the Chinese side. But it's important also to stress the enhanced strategic dialogue that we now have with India, which had taken place on 2 rounds and which will be very much in display when the President visits India in a few months' time, as well as our enhanced strategic dialogue with Indonesia. And that we had a meeting just last week with the Secretary here in Washington and her counterparts to show the breadth of that relationship and the increasing importance that we attach to that comprehensive partnership, as we call it. But even there, with the first 2 pillars, that is the bilateral relationships with our allies and the increased bilateral ties with the emerging powers, there's still a third component, which is that we recognize to really have these bilateral relationships achieve all that's possible and to maximize their chance of leading to successful results, we need to embed these relationships in broader regional and global cooperation. And a major focus of our efforts since coming into office has been to strengthen particularly our regional engagement in Asia, although we also are working very hard in other regions as well. And you can see this through the decision of the President to host the first U.S.-ASEAN summit at the leaders level, by our participation in critical regional fora like the ASEAN Regional Forum, Secretary Gates' upcoming participation in the Defense Ministers meeting in Hanoi, and the Secretary's participation as a guest at the East Asia Summit this year, with our anticipation that the President would join next year at the leaders level. These are all represent efforts to try to find ways to develop more effective regional cooperation to deal with these challenges. But I think equally important, it does allow us to embed critical bilateral relationships in a broader context. That has two critical benefits. First, it, I think, relieves the, I think, misplaced but sometimes expressed anxiety that there'll somehow be a condominium of the larger powers at the expense of others, the so-called G2 type argument, which I think neither we nor China have ever given much credit as an idea to, but has sort of caused some discussion in circles in town and elsewhere. But the more we embed our relationships in these, the more confidence we give to others that our enhanced relationship with key powers like India and China or Russia will not come at the expense of smaller powers. But equally important, it makes clear that as we strengthen our ties, they are done in a way that has the perspective of the others, which you're going to be exploring today. And that's very important because we need to make sure that in order to move forward, that these are not seen as competitions between powers for the friendship or support of other countries in the region, but rather things that we do together. And that's why I think we attach importance and appreciation to the fact that when we made our announcement, the Secretary made our announcement of our participation and our engagement in the East Asia Summit, it was welcomed not only by our ASEAN partners and our traditional allies, but also by China. And I think that represents a strong recognition by both of us that it's in neither of our side interests to getting into a bidding war or a kind of recreation of dividing lines in Asia as we move forward to try to manage our relationships. And I think, therefore, not only do these regional relationships enhance the interests of the smaller countries, but in the end, I think it will reduce the risk of competition and rivalry between the larger powers. So that's why the perspective that you're bringing today is so important. And it's in that context that I'll just say a word or two more about the evolution of our relationship with China. I think it's been very clear since the outset the importance that President Obama and I believe President Hu place on our bilateral relationship. They got off to a fast start with a phone call just a week or two after the beginning of this administration and have met frequently since then, beginning with the first meeting in London at the G20 summit there. They've met not only in direct bilateral meetings, but as part of a number of international, increasingly common, it seems, regional and international meetings. And that's allowed us to have a sustained level of engagement, complemented by relatively frequent phone calls, exchange of letters and the like. And that's really critical to providing the context from which the rest of us work to build a constructive and positive relationship with China. And that, of course, at the next levels down include the two strategic and economic dialogues that have taken place since we launched that last year, as well as very frequent meetings on lower levels, including the recent visit here by the Vice Foreign Minister Sui to Washington for a very open and broad-ranging set of dialogue that we held in Washington, and that, of course, was followed up by the enormously successful and important visit of Deputy National Security Advisor Donlin and National Economic Advisor Summers to China the following week. This, I think, reflects the fact that we recognize the opportunities and the opportunities to work together on the big issues of our time to advance the relationship, and see that we also recognize that through this dialogue and engagement we have the kinds of ongoing opportunities to manage potential areas that could be problematic and make sure that they don't get out of control. As is typically the case, I'm not going to say too much on the economic issues here today, but simply note that as our trade and investment relationship has deepened, we not only have a stronger relationship with each other, but it actually deepens our mutual engagement within the region. As we know, the increasingly internationalized and regionalized nature of the supply chain means that we are doing things in a regional context. And many of the things that we import from China originally have their sourcing throughout the rest of the region, particularly Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and the like. And similarly, the natural resources that have fueled China's economic growth and contribute to its export economy often come from partners in the region as well. So building a relationship is important not only to our own economies, but to all the economies of the region. And we recognize that sound economic policies by both us and China are important to the economic health and growth of our partners in the region. So we need to pay attention to this not only for our own sake and to make sure that we take the steps, particularly focusing on China taking the steps which it acknowledges it needs to do, and which we shared that view of the need to rebalance its growth towards domestic demand and to advance and implement a more flexible and market-determined exchange rate. That will benefit all and will help sustain the global recovery that we all are looking forward to. I also want to just briefly highlight the importance of our continued engagement also on the energy side. This is an increasingly important issue, not only because it's critical to our mutual economic growth and the economic interests of the region as a whole, but it's also an opportunity both to look for ways to cooperate in our common interest in making sure that we have a robust, reliable, and secure sense of affordable energy, and to avoid the potential competition that might come from mercantilist policies involved with China's increasing need for foreign sources of energy. And that's one of the reasons why we've appreciated the opportunity and intend to continue our efforts to enhance our dialogue with China on these issues, both bilaterally and multilaterally, because we recognize that China has a legitimate role to play as part of the foreign and global investment environment. But at the same time, it needs to be done in a way that fosters strong market-based approaches rather than rivalrous approaches, and also is built in a manner that's consistent with our common climate objectives as well, working with China to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies and reliance on more carbon-intense sources of energy to work together. And so as we have this dialogue, we want to see China as a partner, as a consuming nation, but I think it's critical that Chinese investments abroad in particular are based on principles of openness and transparency in line with best practices. As I said, climate is an important part of our common challenge. We both, like every other country, share in the common risks associated with increased CO2 emissions and concentration of CO2 in our atmosphere. And while I won't pretend that it hasn't been without its ups and downs, I do think that in the end, the United States and China have found some common ground as we moved towards the adoption of the Copenhagen Protocol, a pragmatic attempt to move forward on the agenda, recognizing that to have an effective regime, we need important national commitments, and that in the end, as nation states, we are going to have to build these strategies based on national policies, but also a recognition that we have some responsibility to each other on this shared planet to deal with the collective challenge of reducing carbon emissions. And so we want to build on the Copenhagen Protocol, and particularly on the elements of openness, transparency, and accountability that are critical to the success of the overall Copenhagen approach, which we both share. And so we both have, as the largest emitters in the world, we have special responsibilities. We take that seriously, and we continue to work with China to make sure that they are a strong partner in dealing with that. As I said, we've had all these areas, and just as I mentioned to begin with, on dealing with global economic crisis and the need to work together on those issues. We have a good track record of beginning to build even a stronger relationship on cooperation. But there are also risks as we go forward, and no area is more potentially fraught with danger to the constructive, stable relationship, not only for us, but for everyone in the region, than the evolution of the Chinese military. As we've said from the beginning of the administration, that we understand with China's growing economic growth, there will be a modernization of its military. That's understandable and natural as the country has more capabilities and resources to devote to its own defense and security, and every country is entitled to do that. But there are ways in which China's military modernization can contribute to and enhance regional and global security, and there are ways that could pose some risk to that. And it is critical in order to make sure that we have the positive consequences, like China's ability to contribute to the anti-piracy missions in the Gulf of Aden and to contribute to humanitarian relief and the like, all of which requires a more capable Chinese Navy, that those efforts don't lead to competition, rivalry, and tensions in the region. And while we can't be certain that we'll agree in every respect, the one thing we're confident of is we don't talk to each other, that the risk of miscalculation or misunderstanding will be very high. And so we place enormous importance on military-to-military dialogue and a broader security dialogue. And we are encouraged after a period that seemed to have an interruption in that we seem poised to move back in a more constructive direction to begin re-engagement on that front. I want to stress, as I have so many times before, we don't view the military-to-military dialogue on the part of China as somehow a favor to the United States. It's a favor to everyone because it's in everyone's interest that these things take place. And I think, well, again, dialogue doesn't guarantee agreement. It's pretty certain that we have a much better chance of finding common ground and finding ways of surmounting our disagreements if we're engaged in discussion. On the security front, we obviously have a couple of issues that are very front and center in our relationship, and they are very much related to our broader interest in global nonproliferation. This is something that is an inherently united interest of China and the United States. We both have an interest in making sure that weapons of mass destruction don't spread either to countries which might not handle them responsibly or to even more dangerous non-state actors who could use them in ways that would threaten the security of both of us. And so that core premise for our cooperation is very strong. But we also have to turn that basic strategic objective into common working efforts. And I think over the past 2 years we've demonstrated, though it takes time to work out the details, that in both dealing with the Korean nuclear challenge and with Iran, that U.S.-China cooperation embedded in these broader multilateral efforts really has produced important results. And that's why I stressed at the beginning the importance of these multilateral frameworks, because I think it's much easier for the United States and China to find common ground when we're working in the context of the six parties, or whether we're working in the context of the Security Council. It gives a greater sense that we're not just doing this for narrow national interests, but also for the broader global interest in stability and the prevention of proliferation. And I think you all know the details of our cooperation, both with respect to North Korea and vis-a-vis Iran. Our common work on Iran is enormously important. We think that the decision to move forward on Resolution 1929 is a very clear demonstration on the part of the entire international community that Iran faces a unequivocal choice. And we believe that not only because of the direct impact of the sanctions, but the strong signal they send, that we may be in a better position to move forward on the diplomatic track. Again, no guarantees of success, but our cooperation with China, as well as with the other members of the P5 and the Security Council, was critical in achieving this result. And similarly, on the Korean Peninsula, we have a shared interest both in making sure that we reverse North Korea's nuclear and missile programs, and also that we sustain peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. And our strong message to not only China but all of our friends in the region has been that ultimately we cannot have peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula if we don't address Korea's nuclear program and we don't see the implementation of the 2005 Joint Declaration. It's not a trade-off. You don't get peace and stability by ignoring the nuclear program. Quite the opposite. And I think we've seen, as we've had to deal with the consequences of the North Korean attack on the South Korean Cheonan, that without addressing this very clearly and the need to address the provocative actions of North Korea, that there are risks to the peninsula. And that's why we've made very clear to our friends in China that our efforts to strengthen our ties with South Korea are critical if we don't have a stronger and more effective response to reduce the danger that North Korea poses. And I think the strong actions that we've taken in partnership with South Korea and Japan sends a clear signal that we will do what we need to do to assure our own security and that of our partners. But we're also deeply engaged with China and Russia to sustain the effort to keep a diplomatic track open. And we had very productive discussions with China's representative to the six-party talks, Wu Dawei, just a few days ago, and we look forward to continuing to find common ground to move forward on that. So I think what we've seen across the board is whether it's in the economic sphere, whether it's in energy and climate, whether it's on political and security issues or broader issues of human welfare, that there's a tremendous opportunity for us to build the U.S.-China relationship. But the great strengths of that relationship will come if we do it in a context and mindful of the important consequences of that relationship for all of our neighbors in Northeast and Southeast Asia, and increasingly important role of India as a part of that. The more we work together, the more we build bilateral ties in the context of this regional and global cooperation, the more we really will have a success for all the countries of the region, which I think is quite achievable. There are tremendous strengths in this region, economic strengths, political strengths, strengths of culture and tradition that we can build on, and these frameworks allow us to do this in a way to take advantage of the potentials there, as well as manage the difficulties of this important and challenging transition that's taking place in East Asia. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your comments.
Secretary, you're willing to take some questions?
Absolutely.
Would you rather take them at the podium or sitting down?
I'll do it from up here. That's fine.
Okay.
Right here.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. You spoke of the ups and downs at Copenhagen. Actually, there were ups and downs in general U.S.-China relationship this year, starting from the Taiwan arms sales in January, then the President's meeting.
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, John Zan with CTI TV of Taiwan. The President's meeting with the Dalai Lama, and then the South Korean ship incident in March, and the subsequent military exercises. Do you consider, with the meeting in Beijing recently, do you consider the bilateral relationship back on track? One other side question on that is how do you see the recent tension in Sino-Japanese relationship because of the ship incident near the Diaoyu Islands? Are you doing anything to calm the situation down? Thank you very much.
You know, I think one of the things about the opportunity to step back and look at evolution's relationships is this is not something, it's like a baseball game. You don't try to see where things are in the fifth inning. And of course there'll be ups and downs. But I think there's been a strong commitment from the beginning from the two presidents about the importance of this relationship. And we don't agree on everything, so we're obviously going to have areas of disagreement. But I have never believed that there was ever a fundamental threat to that basic view that we should make every effort to see where we can sustain this positive cooperative relationship that the two presidents have committed to. And that's why dialogue and engagement is so important, because we have to remind each other of the broader context in which if we're going to have a relationship that's going to sustain over a variety of issues, we have to be able to have our disagreements without undermining the relationship. And that will be the test over the long term, whether we can have disagreements and understand that that doesn't threaten the basic intentions of the two countries vis-a-vis each other. I, in a previous life, spent a lot of time on trade and economic disputes with our European partners. We fought vigorously about bananas, and I think we're still fighting about subsidies to aircraft. But nobody doubts the strategic strength of the relationship between the United States and Europe. So that is the challenge. And obviously we don't have the same kind of relationship with China that we have with our traditional strategic partners, where the strategic trust is there, and we have confidence that we can have these disputes without questioning each other's intentions. That's why dialogue is especially important in these evolving relationships, and that's why the efforts that we've made over the last year, both to recognize we have disagreements and that we're not going to sacrifice our principal positions just for the sake of the relationship, and neither is China. But at the same time, there are ways to work through these things that minimize the disagreements and the consequences of the disagreements. And I think all of the efforts through the year have reminded us of that basic principle. On Japan and China, again, we always have stressed that we want to see good relations among all the countries in the region. Good relations between China and Japan are in our interest. It's in the interest of everybody else in the region. And so they have their differences. They clearly have a significant territorial dispute. It's a long-standing territorial dispute. They need to have engagement and discussion. I think the recent incident clearly unfortunate given the fact that there appeared to be some positive movement in the dialogue between Japan and China over some of these East Sea issues. And so I think this is something our two partners will have to work out. We have our own positions that we've articulated on the territorial issues, but the important thing is to sustain dialogue and to recognize that when you have complex situations like this, that engagement is the best way to move forward.
Eric McVeigh, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. Jim, it seemed to me that the disruption was sharper in our relationship with China, sharper and deeper this time, and that China was sort of more obnoxious, more aggressive, more pushy in certain areas, and now it seems that it's reversing. Have you thought about why those two things happened?
To be honest, Eric, I don't know what the metric is of sharper or deeper. The only thing, if I were looking for sharper or deeper, I would look at actions by one side or the other that was threatening or damaging to the other, and I don't think there was that. I think that views were expressed. But I don't think that fundamentals were disrupted. The only thing, from our perspective, was the suspension of some of the dialogues, which is not, fundamental threat to our interests. We think it was not in China's interest to do it, so we're glad that we're getting back on track. But I think that this is all, there are going to be adjustment issues, and each side needs to understand each other better. And I think the Chinese side understood why we did what we did on issues that were of concern to them. And we had extensive opportunities subsequent to then to explain in even greater detail what have been our sustained positions on these things. There were no surprises, which is very important in these relationships. I think that's one of the things that is important to both sides, is that we don't have surprises. And I think that the net result potentially makes the relationship even stronger. Yes, right here.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary. My question is, since Hillary Clinton delivered the speech in Hanoi and giving events in Asia since then, do you see there are more opportunity for the U.S. to pursue a leadership role in Asia? Thank you.
Well, we all love to quote Secretary Gates' famous statement that the United States is a resident power in the Asia Pacific, and so we expect to play a leadership role, but that's not at the expense of any other country. It's not a zero-sum situation, but it means that I think our partners in the region expect us to play an active and sustained role. We bring unique capabilities to contribute to a strong economy and a stable political and security environment there, and we are going to be involved in a sustained way, and I think that's the thing to focus on. Many of these things and many of the institutions we're building depend very heavily on consensus, and we understand this. This is not a question of somebody coming in, whether it's the United States or China, and dictating to any of the countries of the region, large or small, about what they're going to do. Rather, it's working together to find common solutions. For most of the issues that we face, the interests are more in common than adverse. Even in complicated areas of maritime and territorial issues, we have common interest in freedom of navigation. All of the economies of the region, including the United States, depend heavily on the safety and security of shipping and to make sure that we have a predictable environment for that. So our engagement will be strong. We intend to provide leadership because we think that in order to get collective and cooperative action, it requires leadership, but we welcome others to step up to the plate as well. So it's not a rivalrous type of situation, and we look forward to partnering with all the countries in the region, big and small, to move forward on that shared agenda. That's if I'm missing somebody in the back, so we'll go right there.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Nadia Chao with the Liberty Time, Taiwan. Last week in Geneva, you talk about a new order in Asia. You also talk about, U.S.-China relationship. There's no strategic trust there. So I wonder, do you think it's still necessary to build a strategic reassurance to require both countries to do that? And could you elaborate a little bit, what kind of a new order you are envisioning in Asia? And for the U.S. and the Taiwan relation, let me, if you allowed, there's no surprise, but many people in Taiwan also feel there's no passion anymore in this relationship. You know, we haven't seen one cabinet member visit Taiwan, and the TIFA has been postponed like indefinitely, even though there's so many, you know, U.S. officials visit China almost every month. So could you just tell us, you know, what's the status now in U.S. and Taiwan relationship? It's, you know, surprise-free, but what else do we have?
Well, it's important to be precise. So in answer to your first question, I'm quite confident I didn't say there was no strategic trust between the United States and China. What I said was that it's important that we build strategic trust, and that's something that both sides have emphasized, but it's not a binary thing where you either have it or you don't have it. You have more or less of it, and we need more of it. And that's what we're focused on. And the concept of reassurance is part of the element of doing that. How do we build trust? How do we deal with the situations where there are ambiguous acts that each side is concerned about the implications, and how we use dialogue to get that? So, for example, we know that the Chinese expressed concern about some of the military exercises that we conducted following the sinking of the Chaonam. We made clear to China that this has nothing to do with China, that the purpose of this was to strengthen our alliance with South Korea at a time in which the North Koreans were challenging that. So part of reassurance is being able to explain in detail why we made the choices that we did and why those were not directed at China, as well as to make clear to China how it could help in dealing with the challenge posed by North Korea. So when I talk about reassurance, that is the quintessential example of reassurance, is that we are comfortable in explaining to each other that actions which the other is concerned about shouldn't be of concern. We clearly hear that from the Chinese side vis-a-vis some of its own maritime activities. And that's why the more dialogue we have, and we can explain what that is, and we can reassure each other about each other's intentions, is critical. And I think that does remain important, particularly in areas where there is some inherent ambiguity about the nature of our activities. So I think this is a very fruitful area for us to continue. It's a dangerous road for me to go down to talk about passion and diplomacy. But I would simply say that they're at the core of, it's an unofficial relationship that we have with Taiwan, but there is a very strong commitment and appreciation of the tremendous achievements that the people of Taiwan have accomplished, both in the economic and especially in the political sphere. And we have an enormous respect for the very vibrant, active, open democracy that Taiwan has. And so if Americans can be passionate about anything, it's about democracy. And so in that sense, I think our feelings remain very, very strong. We have a very continued commitment to our engagement through the Taiwan Relations Act and all of the other elements that have characterized our unofficial relationship. Right there. Gentleman right by the microphone. Yep.
Thank you very much. A journalist from China News Service. And on Chinese side, they have stressed that building up the mutual trust is a top priority for the U.S.-China relations. But there are lots of doubts about that because some critics argue that there are lots of critical differences between these two nations. So what do you think about those doubts? And could you just describe and how the two nations can build up the mutual trust, given that they have so many critical differences? Thank you.
I think we have significant differences, but I think we also have significant areas of common interest. And I think, as I've said, what we found in our discussions over the almost 2 years that we've been in office is how often these common interests dominate the agenda. We had a huge common interest in dealing with the global economic and financial crisis. Both of our countries, our people were severely threatened by that, and we worked together very effectively. We have an interest in dealing with the risk of climate change. We have an interest in dealing with piracy, with terrorism, with nonproliferation, with making sure that there are secure and reliable and affordable sources of energy to sustain our economies. Across the board, and we have an interest in peace and stability in the region. So we have broad interest. We have some differences. We certainly have some differences when it comes to issues like human rights. when it comes to democracy. We have some different perspectives on that, and we feel strongly about it, and we will continue to engage. But I think it's important that we have re-engaged the human rights dialogue with China. We have an opportunity to discuss these things. Similarly, when it comes to some of the issues that have concerned us both on the military side, we need to have greater confidence building and trust building. And that's why we stress the importance of military-to-military dialogue. And that's why we are encouraged to see this looks like it may be getting back on track. I think it benefits both of us. But I think at the end of the day, you know, the very clear messages that the two presidents have sent out provides a framework in which all the other forces within our governments need to operate. And I think we've gotten clear signals from our president and from President Hu about what kind of relationship they want to have. I think it was significant that President Hu came to Washington for the Nuclear Security Summit as an indication of the importance of the relationship, that the President and Premier Wen Jiabao will be meeting in September. These are the relationships of countries that want to try to find common ground and want to send a message not only to their other members of their government, but to their people about their hopes for these relationships, not just their fears.
I'm Brahma Cheleni. I'm from the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. After your answer on Taiwan, may I take you to another sensitive issue, which also starts with T, Tibet, in particular with the Panchen Lama issue. Not the Panchen Lama that was appointed by the Tibetans and who was abducted in 1995 and has disappeared, but the Panchen Lama appointed by the Beijing rulers. After the 2008 Tibetan revolt, the Chinese government has sought to raise the domestic profile of the Panchen Lama, and this year it has also sought to provide international legitimacy to the Chinese appointed Panchen Lama. And as part of that endeavor, recently, just 6 days ago, the Singaporean foreign minister became the first foreign dignitary to meet with the Panchen Lama. My question is about U.S. policy on this, because the same course that the Chinese government has adopted on the Panchen Lama, they intend to adopt on the Dalai Lama after he passes away. They intend to impose their own imposter, Dalai Lama. So U.S. policy on the Panchen Lama is important because it sets the trend as to what will happen after the Dalai Lama passes away. Is the U.S. State Department willing to press Beijing to release the Panchen Lama, who had been abducted in 1995 and about whom nothing has been heard the past 15 years?
Our policy on Tibet is that we have engaged very intensively with the Chinese in support of building a dialogue more directly between the Dalai Lama and Tibetans and the government in Beijing. We think ultimately these issues have to be resolved between dialogue between the two of them. We don't think these are issues that outsiders can resolve. But we also think that dialogue would be in everyone's interest. And so we have strongly encouraged that. We've encouraged that within the framework of what is the political perspective of the United States, which is to recognize that Tibet is a part of China, but that there are important religious and cultural issues there that should be addressed and that are part of the broader commitments to human rights and respect for religion that the United States believes in everywhere. So we think within the framework of dialogue between China and the Dalai Lama and his representatives is the best way to try to address those issues.
Bob Hathaway at the Wilson Center. Welcome back.
Thanks, Bob.
You briefly mentioned India in your prepared remarks. As you know, there was considerable angst in India last November following a joint statement by President Hu and President Obama suggesting that China and the United States should work together on South Asian issues. Can you tell us a bit about the administration's thinking on the proper role for China in South Asia, specifically with respect to Afghanistan, but also with some of the broader issues involving India and Pakistan as well?
Well, there's an old legal expression, expressio unis et exclusio alteris, but it does not apply in this case. And the statement that we made in in Beijing was not to suggest that we were going to do it at the expense of anybody else or to exclude anybody else. China has an important role. It's a neighbor of South Asia, and it's unimaginable that China would not be involved. And so the question is, can we work together in a positive way on shared interest in creating peace, stability, and economic opportunity in South Asia? So I don't think I know there's a certain sensitivity in India about that, but I don't see that it should be the case. India has a good and rich relationship with China. Very fortunate to have a very knowledgeable China hands now at senior levels in the Indian government, and I think that's a good thing. And so we welcome a constructive involvement by China, and that's why we talk to them about it. It's because we would like Chinese involvement to be constructive, to help us deal with the challenge of peace and stability in Afghanistan and dealing with making sure that it doesn't become a terrorist haven again, which would threaten all of us, to building a relationship and cooperating to allow democracy to continue in Pakistan and to deal with the economic challenges that they face, so a more secure Pakistan can be a better partner for India and other countries in the region. So I see many positive reasons for China to be involved, and it will be involved because its interests are there. It has economic interests, security interests, political interests, but it ought to be done in a way that's not at the expense of others. And it's clear that we're very sensitive to the interests of all of our partners there. And just as we talk about South Asia with China, we talk about East Asia with India. And that's an important part of our dialogue. And we just had a very, very productive meeting chaired on our side by Assistant Secretary Campbell with the Indian counterparts. And I think it's notable that, as you all know, Assistant Secretary Campbell is not the Assistant Secretary for South Asia. He's the Assistant Secretary for East Asia, because we see India as a East Asia country. We engage with them on issues like North Korea and the like because we think of the importance that India plays. And as I mentioned at the outset, I think one of the reasons why we see, I didn't fully answer the question about the evolving order in East Asia, but I mean, one of the elements of it is that we think India is a key part, and that we think the institutions should reflect that, because we think that India has both important interest and a lot to contribute to the common interest there. So I think at the end of the day, it will be important for all of us to work together, bilaterally and regionally, to deal with the deep challenges, not only of South Asia and its southern part, but what is in our Bureau of South Asia, South and Central Asia, the important challenges that we have in Central Asia. I was just there a few weeks ago, and we would like China to play a constructive role in helping to deal with the challenges of stabilizing the situation in Kyrgyzstan, dealing with the problems of the borders in Tajikistan and the like. It's a positive sum thing. It's critical for those countries that they don't feel that this is a rivalry between us and China, or China and Russia, or all three of us at the same time, but rather for us to work to support their economic and political development. So I think we welcome a constructive role by China. We look forward to a different forum in which we can engage the other countries in the region to discuss those as well. I do one more.
Gil Rosman from Princeton. I wonder if you can update. I get them back. I wonder if you will update Wu Dawei's visit and the gap between the United States and China and how to proceed to relaunch the six-party talks. The impression is that China is not stressing denuclearization as an urgent theme, has more of an orientation now to some kind of regional peace treaty and restructuring of the security arrangements in the area, and seems to be closer to the North Korean position. Do you think the gap is bridgeable and that we're likely to have the six-party talk soon?
Well, whoever got that impression wasn't talking to Wu Dawei, because I didn't get that impression at all, to be honest. Indeed, what was striking to me was the degree of convergence. I think that there is a recognition that there is simply little value in moving forward without some very concrete indication that the North Koreans are interested in implementing the 2005 statement. And I think the Chinese were very clear on that. There was no disagreement at all, that they recognized that given what's happened on a number of fronts, both with the actions of the North Koreans last year and then following the Cheonan, that we're simply not going to go back and just kind of go back to talking, that there is a framework that everybody's agreed on, and now the time is to demonstrate seriousness of purpose about implementing it. And I got a very clear and I think very positive indication from my conversations with Ambassador Wu that they share that view, Now, we have to figure out how we get there, but I think we will have those talks, and I've actually lost track of where Steve is, but anyway, so we are actually, I think, on the same framework, and now talking about how to move forward on that framework and to make clear to the North that on the one hand, that path is open, but in order to get on that path, that they need to show that they're serious about this. This is serious business, and I think if they are, then I think we're all prepared to move forward. But nobody is particularly pushing to have peace talks or have some kind of conference just for the sake of having a conference. The ticket to move forward is a concrete demonstration by the North that they're going to implement their denuclearization commitment. Then other things are possible. They've always been possible, but we don't see it without a clear and unmistakable understanding on the North side. And we also believe that in order to move this forward, we need to see some progress on the North-South dimension as well. Anyway, thank you all. Good questions. It's always a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Secretary Steinberg, for those very informative remarks. I think we have a break now for 15 minutes.